Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. This week, bringing you a special American Probation and Parole Association edition. As the voice of the community corrections industry, APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association. In addition to their U.S. members, the American Probation and Parole Association is supported by international members who are actively involved in strengthening community corrections work in their own countries. APPA's International Relations Committee aims to connect community corrections professionals around the world to inspire and share insights from their unique experiences and best practices. Welcome to this special APPA episode of The Criminologist. And now, welcome your host, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 169 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are bringing you yet another special hybrid edition as we are teaming up with our good friends at the American Probation and Parole Association, in particular, their International Relations Committee. We hope to weave in more and more of these special edition episodes in the future, so stay tuned in particular for those. Or, if you're first-time listeners, I encourage you to go back and catch up on our previous APPA collaborations or any of our episodes from our catalog of amazing installments. Now, for newer listeners and or those who may not be aware, the American Probation and Parole Association really is the voice of the community corrections industry. APPA serves as the field's leading professional membership association, and their work is supported by thousands of passionate members throughout the United States and really around the world. Now, as noted, the Criminologist podcast works closely with the International Relations Committee to highlight and showcase some of the great works of our partners around the world and to really get the word out that APPA is more than just an American institution. We really embrace worldwide membership. It's always exciting for me when I have a guest returning to the show, and I'm really delighted to be sharing my recent conversation with Nina Hanssen. Nina's been on the show before talking about her book, The Norwegian System, and really all the great work she does around the world promoting dynamic security and some of the other innovative things coming out of Norway. Her book is entitled The Norwegian Prison System, Hauled in Prison and Beyond. Nina's book presents a comprehensive overview of the Norwegian Correctional Service and the values and principles underlying its operations, using the renowned Halden Prison as a case study. Now, as noted, Nina has been on the show in the past. I happen to have caught her during a recent United States book tour. She was in New York City on her way to Washington, D.C. So, without any further ado, I'm going to share my dialogue with Nina Hanssen, talking about the Norwegian prison system, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Nina. So good to see you again. Why don't we begin by you reintroducing yourself to at least some of the listeners? Again, this is your second appearance on the Criminologist podcast. Tell us about the journey you've been on, your amazing work up to this point, which has led you to where you are today here in the United States, promoting your amazing book all about the Norwegian prison system.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you for having me back on this great show. I think, I've got so much response for other people being on your show, so I just want to repeat. It's a brilliant podcast about criminology, but it's also a podcast about social policy, and I really, really enjoy your show. And it's an honor, of course, to be back. The second time. So my background is that I'm a Norwegian. I have 3 sons, and I'm currently lives in Oslo. And I have also previously lived in Britain, in Kenya, in the Middle East. And in Kenya in 1992, I actually met my first prisoner kind of friend, and he was called Koigi Wawanvere, and he was, in prison in Kenya in the maximum prisons, prison in Nairobi, and I got to know him as a journalist. So I wrote a lot of stories from inside the prison. So this is, the first time I met, prison and prisoners, as you sometimes say, or residents. And later I went to South Africa and I even met Nelson Mandela. And, these prisoners, they actually inspire me so much. So in my new book, I actually have 4 prisoners also talking. And I think that's the aspect of this book. It's not just a boring academic book. It's actually a book for everyone to read.
I love the approach you take involving, as you said, those justice-involved individuals who've been incarcerated, and their insights just pack so much more value than, as you said, what we get from the research. You and I are both researchers, and we appreciate the efficacy of research. But when we're trying to change the message and get the word out and change systems like we're trying to do, those unique voices are so impactful. I was just interviewing a woman, Kagan Carey, over the United Kingdom, also a prison researcher, and she made the same comments, that it's when you talk to those people that really touch you, so to speak, or give you those insights, that they're the credible messengers, as we like to say, of changing systems. I asked you back to talk about some of your travels around the globe as of late, since our last interview, but why don't we begin with maybe a backdrop of a review of that term dynamic security and what's that all about? I think that's something new for the listeners here in the United States that aren't familiar with that approach, but maybe shed some light on dynamic security and what that approach means within a correctional management system.
Yes, thank you so much. But first of all, I actually believe that education is crucial for both prison officers and leader. And as you know, in Norway, we have like a 2 years education in the staff academy. And, they receive full payment during their education. And they are taught, subject that we are all concerned about with psychology, criminology, law, human rights and ethics. And, I'm really impressed by the prison officers in Norway, because they don't only do dynamic security, they really do a very great job that is worth exporting over here. So the contact officer is also part of it. In Norway, every prisoners, they got a contact officer that follow them up and, through the sentence. And it hasn't always been like that. I just have to mention that this approach came into practice in the 90s. And that was actually after one murder on a female prison officer in Ila prison in Oslo, and later also another murder on a prison officer. Then we started thinking new again, and we did, thinking how can we actually go on expanding this contact officer, because that's all about, the relation between the staff and the prisoners. So the Norwegian dynamic security, it's characterized by the fact that the prison officer collect information, of course, and establish kind of relationship that are useful in effort to inspire and motivate, but also as well as conducting the risk assessment that everybody has to do. So it's all about relations. And I think, this is the future. We have to speak to each other, especially now with all the technology and the machines and everything. I think that is the secret to our success, if you can call it that I believe, we are using a lot of time in Norway with the dynamic security, not only the static security, but the dynamic security between the people. And to be able to do this, you need time and you need enough staff, and I think that is maybe the problem here in US, that you probably don't have enough staff, but also, it's not that the way you're thinking here. So I'm very surprised that this is not a topic also in the American correctional system, because I think the more you focus on static security, it's not the way forward. So that's why I really believe that this is the way forward. And as an example for the listeners, in Halden Prison, which is a high security prison for men, they have a library, they have a gym, they have a kitchen, and they have a lot of places for people to work and study. And what is unique is that the prison officer actually do that together with them. They eat together. They make food together. They play football or soccer, as we call it in Norway. They exercise. They take a walk in the wood, because usually in the Norwegian big prisons, we also have small woods you can play or you can go walk in. And they really interact and motivate the prisoners. So I think, my co-author, I have to mention him, Are Høydahl. He was the governor of Halden Prison for 12 years. And he is convinced that this is the secret to our success.
Nina, this is either going to be a long interview because you're unpacking so many awesome things, or we'll, of course, have to have you back for a third time.
Yes! I'll play drums for you then.
Yes, thank you. That's a little inside joke there between Nina and I. But when you mentioned, for example, things about your surprise that this dynamic security approach hasn't taken traction here in the United States yet. One thing I'm trying to change right now, in fact. But I wanted to ask you along those lines. Often with implementation science, we know the devil's in the details, and there's a slogan in implementation science, which I love, but it gets at culture is king. If you can't address that culture, there's another slogan I love. They say culture eats strategy for lunch. Well, lunch, breakfast, and dinner. You spoke of the experience in Norway in the 90s of sort of shifting that lens. Any inside tips or advice as to not simply training the technical aspects of dynamic security, but steps that we can get at to change the culture and the mindset? When you were talking about, for example, the correctional officers eating with the residents and playing football / soccer, I mean, those types of concepts are so alien, and I'm not trying to be too cynical, but I'm just sort of imagining how they would land on the mindset of our existing correctional officers. What were some ways that you began to chip away at that notion of us versus them?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think education is the king. I mean, I think Nelson Mandela said, something about that. If you can actually educate people, and I think that's the clue. And of course, you need more money into, maybe building a staff academy. And I think you should be able to do that, because I think that will makes the system very much better. Because as I mentioned before, I'm very impressed, by the very, very well-trained and dedicated staff in Norway. I mean, I think that surprised people who's coming to Norway to see what is surprising. Of course, they are surprised by a lot of things. I can mention a list for you, but at least they see that the people there, they are so dedicated and they are so well-trained. So even if it looks like a kind of friendship, the dynamic security, it looks like they have friends in prison, but, they are very clever. So I believe, also another change in Norway, we established after this murder and everything I told you about, we established the Norwegian Correctional Service at the national level. So, you have somebody there in between the politicians and the practitioners who's, organizing things like having established international relations, like you have AMEND in US. You have a big cultural program addressing, the prison officers, and you have a lot of other projects too, cooperation, because I believe that we can learn from you, and you maybe can get inspired by us. And of course, the first step is reading our book.
Let's talk about your book entitled Norwegian Prison System, Halden Prison and Beyond. It talks about, among other things, those practical implications of the Norwegian prison experience, and it highlights what is working well and even perhaps what could be improved. Could you maybe touch on each of those points to start it off at least? What's working well and what could be improved?
Yeah, I think, what's working well is the dynamic security. It's in our, it's the practice. So that's something that people are, and also I believe that the normality principle works well. The idea that the life inside the prison should be as close as possible to the life in the community. So, all the prisoners in Norway have access to public service from the local and the municipal service providers. And, they have the right to vote. It's a lot of this thing that I think the normality principle works, and that import models, that they get this access to the public sector. What can be improved? It's a long list too, because even in Norway lately, we have seen that there have been a budget cut over years, and resources to the correctional system is not very sexy for the politicians to address. And even if you put money in there, you don't get more votes. So it's a difficult nut for the politician. And so I think, the staff ratio at the moment is not what it should supposed to be. So, the prison unions, we have two big unions working for the prison officers in Norway, and they claim it's a catastrophe now. So there are prisons in Norway that struggling with money, of course, and to give actually the service that they really, really want. And of course, in the book, I have two chapters that it's not very nice about the Norwegian prison service. And one is about psychiatric prisoners doesn't get help, lot of isolations, and there is a lot of prison pain, I think we call it, like people with mental disorders, somatic disables, and more also age-related disorder than before, because we have a older population in the prison that needs more than just the normal service. And in the book, Randi Rosenquist, she's a very, very famous psychiatrist, and she's one of the best. I mean, she is telling about how the situation is and how we can improve it. So I think we have a lot of challenge in Norway too. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but at least I think it's good to be honest and not, painting, the sunshine story about the Norwegian prison service.
Yeah, that's a great approach to have. I want to back up a little bit to when you talked about the normality principle, because I think that is something that listeners, particularly those who work in a correctional setting, even one which is focused primarily on static security, can maybe relate to and wrap their heads around. But it's something that when I hear, as you noted, what that looks like in practice, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it can include even the residents wearing their own street clothes and like you said, making it as normal as possible. I think that's one of the big struggles I've seen when I sort of push this dynamic security is I'm immediately confronted with, well, prisons aren't supposed to be a happy place or a comfortable place. They're supposed to be about punishment. And what people don't understand is this notion that being removed from the community is the punishment. Being removed from your family is the punishment. Being out of society is the punishment. We don't need to pile it on by making it just such a miserable experience, which to a lot of folks that normality principle is just so counterintuitive to what they're thinking a correctional sentence should be all about. I love the expression they have over there in Norway with prisons about it's essentially the philosophy of these prisoners are your future neighbors.
Yes.
And how would you want your neighbor experiencing a 5-year, for example, prison sentence, as being treated as an animal or a subhuman, or looking at it as, this person's going to be my neighbor at some point? How can I balance those legitimate security and correctional and rehabilitation concerns with bearing in mind they're my future neighbor?
They are. And also, I like that approach, because we should always have this in our mind, that they are there. I mean, they are residents just for a while, and then they are coming up. Who do we want as our neighbors and friends? And also another question I usually add is, what if your son or daughter or somebody in your family get into prison? How do you want them to be treated? Because they are coming out to you.
I often tell, when I train and teach probation officers, that, your role is in many respects that of a teacher. You're teaching your clients a new skill, whether they're cognitive behavior related or actual vocational skills or educational skills. Again, I would contend it's more about their skills around their thinking. But again, if I'm trying to train the probation officers to think of themselves as teachers, well, then I could extend that logic and say, in a correctional facility, we're still trying to teach people. They're still programming. But when you send your kids off to college, do you want that experience to be one where it's most conducive to learning, or whether it's, we stayed at a horrible dormitory and they marched us out a few hours a day to go to classes, and then we came back to this uncomfortable setting? I mean, again, it's really what we call the responsivity principle. We have to create this ideal learning environment. And that applies whether it's a probation caseload in the community or whether it's a maximum security prison.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's important.
It looks like you kicked the book tour off in Oslo, Norway. What was the reception of your book like in that country where it all began, you could say?
Yeah, as you know, the book is not aimed at the Norwegian readers, because it's a book to inspire people from other countries. But we presented our book, of course, in the directorate in Norway, and also invited college. It was in the same, they are based in the same place in Lillestrøm. And we had one for, the people working there and the leaders. And I think it was a very interesting launch, because then we had a discussion, we had questions, and the response was very interesting, that we managed to, it's kind of a small book, but it's a secret, because the letters are quite small too. So I'm sorry about that. So some of us need glasses to read it, but we have also included, as I said, 4 prisoner story, and we have a lot of photos, and you can also see the architecture of 2 of the largest prisons, Halden prison, and also a new prison in Agder that we built during the pandemic. We opened just in the pandemic, which is, we call kind of the future prison. So you can see the building through the photos, and so it's actually, I think what the people are in Norway are more surprised over, it's the stories from the prisoners actually, and that we actually managed to compile quite a easy read book in English, because it's not our first language, as you can hear, but at least we did it together, me and Arya, and they were very interested in the book. And later we had a public reception, like a book launch, and there were so many people there, and there were ambassadors from different countries, and we have 2 musicians, one playing Johnny Cash, and the other one also, in Cash is King. I mean, Johnny Cash is King. So, we had 2 musicians, because I really enjoy also making, music at the launch, because I think that makes it more interested. And I've got a lot of emails and response after the launch in Oslo, that people think it's really interesting, even in Norway.
You said something earlier which has me thinking on something I've been thinking for a long time, but it's that the population that we're describing, whether we refer to them as inmates or prisoners or residents, they really do need to have a better public relations person, because I think half of, or a good chunk of the struggles simply come from a bias that the public has, or by extension, that policymakers have about that population. And things like your book or this podcast, when I have on guests with lived experience, I think it goes a long way in just humanizing that population and getting us out of that, as I said earlier, that us them mindset that these folks are just these monsters or whatever other villains we've built up in our heads. And that's simply not the case when you meet the vast majority of individuals who are incarcerated.
They are like you and me, Joe.
And as regular listeners of the podcast know, I sign off every episode with my tagline, there's no them, there's only us. Exactly.
That's true. Exactly.
From Oslo, I know you went to Edinburgh, Scotland. I love Scotland. And of course, many in the field associate Scotland with the great work that they're doing with desistance research. So did that backdrop of knowledge around desistance come into play when you were launching the book in Edinburgh?
You know, I was so lucky because we were invited by the Scottish Parliament to actually launch the book there, and they made a big event, open for public there, and because I think they are even ahead of the Norwegian Correctional Service in some ways, like they are building very great prisons for women now. That I think actually it's more close to the normality principle than our women prison, because I'm not proud of the Norwegian prisons for women. I think we have a long way to get the equality in that sense. So I visit actually the HMP Edinburgh prison, which I was really impressed. I met this Governor David Aberti, and they have done a great job on also the population with the what is it called? LHBTQ plus. I mean, it's so many shortenings, so I don't, but they have a great population, and, they've been working on that. And I think that's something also we can learn from. And on our launch, there were like so many criminologists coming and prison leaders, even a couple of lords were there. So I was like very impressed that they actually came to our launch. And the governor, he said after the launch that the book is more about not only about prison and imprisonment, but it's also about social justice and the political that will change a way a country might look of offending and its real causes. That's what he said to me after the launch. So, nothing makes me more happy than that people in the field actually get inspired. And I was very inspired by the Scottish visit, and I visited 2 prisons there, and I'm going back to see more, because I think we have a lot to learn from the Scottish too.
What a great affirmation to receive from that individual over there who said you're doing more than...
He said it's okay, I can quote him on it, so I asked him.
Perfect, yeah. It's a great quote because it speaks to the value of what you're doing, Nina. It's not just introducing these so-called technical solutions to the crime problem. It's a bigger societal push which has tentacles reaching into so many of our other social, public things we do, the fabric of a lot of the stuff that we do. You mentioned meeting a lot of great fellow criminologists when you were in Edinburgh, up to and including my dear friend, Sarah Lewis. Any stories to share, because I'm just such a Sarah Lewis fan, of any interactions you may have had with Sarah on the book tour?
Sarah, she was actually giving an introduction about her project on our launch, because I invited her, because I'm also I've read her book about Halden, by the way. It's a very nice, neat little book. She's done, her degree about, inspired from Halden prison and also one of the island prisons. So, I've seen her getting into practice in Britain, some of the things she was inspired by in Norway. And she's recently visited Norway to give a speech back to us, how she actually went about, so we can learn from her on how she's approaching this in real life. So I'm also a great fan of her, and I was very honored that she played a part in our book launch.
Regular listeners of this podcast are familiar with Sarah's work. I should note we've been talking about spreading the dynamic security gospel to the United States. Sarah and I are actively involved with that effort. So if you're out there as a prison warden or the director of a correctional facility and you're intrigued by this interview that I'm having with Nina Hanssen, reach out. Sarah and I are looking to export this philosophy to the United States prison establishment over here. I now know that you are in New York to promote your book, Welcome to America. How exciting is it to see your work and your passion around prison reform getting so much attention, so much traction? Talk about some of the stuff that you're doing here in the United States on your book tour.
Yes, thank you so much for all these kind words. It goes straight to my heart. When I visited US 2 years ago, I visited some prisons as well in Pennsylvania, among others. And there I met Dr. Marisa Lopez, who is involved with ICPA, the organization. And we actually talked a lot of times, and she listened to your podcast, by the way. And she actually said to me, let's do something. And she invited me. So she's going to be the host of our book launch in New York on Tuesday at 6:00. And I think it's open for everyone to listen to. So, but I know that this is recorded afterwards, so you might get a recording. But in my presentation in New York, I will, and Are Høydahl will also be there. We'll be also joined by a special guest who has been a prisoner in Rikers, who came to Norway to listen to us. So I'm very, very excited about this meeting, because Dr. Lopez will share the whole session, and we will talk about, what can we learn from Norway. And as you know, Norway has, a lot of 64 times large. The US population is over 64 times larger than Norway. And, you have so many more prisoners here. We have only 57 prisons with a total of 3,600 beds. So, how can we learn from this small little country up in the north, So I think it's going to be very interesting, because she was involved with that project in Pennsylvania, in Chester Prison. And they made actually something called Little Scandinavia in a normal prison. And she will talk about that too, because that's also in the book, a chapter. I think, it's going to be really interesting to be in New York and later Washington, D.C.
Talk about DC. What's that setting like? I'm hoping there will be some policy makers there, or some, as we say, people are in charge of those levers of change, so to speak. So what do you anticipate when you get to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, my host in Washington, D.C. is actually Center for American Progress, which is led by, John Podesta. At least I have met him a couple of times before. He's been visiting Norway a couple of times. And I think they are actually making policies, and maybe I hope that they will make a kind of paper on a prison reform, a former prison reform. And I hope that, meeting with them and maybe some of the politicians. I hope that Joe Biden, of course, will come, and other policymakers, even, everyone. I want to meet everyone when I'm here. I'm in US until the 1st of August, so I'm available for everyone who wants to meet me and discuss, because as you and Sarah, I'm very much involved with trying to change to the better.
You mentioned at one point in our sort of pre-interview the name Glenn Martin. A lot of folks here in the United States are aware of the great work that Glenn does. But do you want to maybe give a shout out to when you'll be connecting with Glenn during your stay here in the United States?
Yes, Glenn, he is a very good person, and we need to listen to people like Glenn. He was a former prisoner, and now I have had the pleasure of having him as visiting Norway recently. So he came, he will talk about his travel from Rikers in New York prison to Norway. I mean, he's a free man, and he's doing a great job now with his project that we will talk about housing former prisoners. And also, we went to 2 prisons in Norway, and for me, it was very interesting to listen to his reflections after visiting Norway. So that's what he will contribute with in our book launch in New York. And I'm very lucky that I met Glenn several times. We've been visiting other countries together, and we'll follow each other because we are on the same path.
What a great ally to have in your cause. Someone with his experience, as we've talked about it really rounds out. You can have as many passionate people such as myself or yourself who may be educators or trainers or even former practitioners, but it's really lacking that perspective that Glenn can bring to really complete that feedback loop of what we're doing and the progress we're making. Speaking of which, you've been traveling around and visiting various correctional facilities, talking to various administrators from a variety of cultures around prison capacity issues. What's your prognosis for dynamic security taking hold as we move forward here?
I think dynamic security is the future. And also, as I said, now when the machine learning and all this digital revolution happening around us, transforming, the way we work, the way we live, the way maybe you run a prison. So I think what is the most important is that relations between people and dynamic security, that this is the kind of future, and I believe that you are able to start doing that as well in US, because you can start with respecting the person and give the prisoner more dignity, as we talked about. You can think about. How do you want to talk to your mother or your brother or your boyfriend or girlfriend, and talk to people in the conversation, you talk to prisoners like that. Start doing that instead of, trying to talk in a different way, So I think that this is the only way we can change. And I think, I hope that maybe this tour in US that I'm doing now can actually change, from status security, which is also important. But we also talk about dynamic security, democratic security. We have a lot of issues. Security is also very well in Norway, but I think the relations between the people working and the people incarcerated, the residents, is the future.
I could not agree more, and I'm glad you brought up the phenomenon of artificial intelligence and this sort of age of technology we live in. I actually did a full-blown podcast episode introducing some of the potential around artificial intelligence a few weeks back. That was really fun to do. But I also follow the work of your neighbor, actually, next door in Finland, Pia Puolaka, who just does a lot of great stuff with technology. So I think the time is really right here. We should strike while the iron's hot. And finally, I'm really glad you mentioned the thing you just said about the little steps around simply showing respect. Earlier in the interview, you did mention the legitimate capacity issues around staffing. We need to hire perhaps more officers, but I feel sadly too often that's used as sort of an excuse by administrators to shun these approaches by simply saying, well, we can't afford it right now. But it doesn't cost anything to be respectful to somebody, or there's so many of these smaller little incremental things we can start doing to tiptoe up to that line, at least, of dynamic security. So maybe to that end, what is a myth or a stereotype about the Norwegian prison system that you'd like to address or dispel here to audiences that aren't just there yet with their agencies?
Yeah, I think the myth that we are too kind towards the prisoners and that being in prison in Norway is as good as being in the luxury hotel and that the prisoners have a better life than the elderly people in Norway. I mean, this is some of the political parties even in Norway make these myths, and this is not the truth. I mean, we treat people with respect, of course, and they have the same access to services as the rest of the neighbors and citizens of Norway, but they don't have the freedom. So you can't say that.
Precisely. If I've got a listener out there who works in a prison as let's just say a line officer, a prison officer, and maybe they're bought in, but their administration is not quite there yet, what is perhaps one thing that a correctional officer, a prison officer, somebody working at a juvenile detention facility could do on their own to begin embracing dynamic security?
Yeah, like I've said before, treat the prisoners with the same respect in conversation as it was your own mother or your boyfriend or girlfriend. Start opening up, maybe, and you can. They say, they say in Norway we have a saying called. They should be more interested in people and get rid of prejudices. We call it fordommer, fordummer. That's a Norwegian sentence, and that says that prejudices makes you stupid because you never know what a person carry. I mean, by looking at it from the outside, because a lot of us are carrying more in our luggage that you can't see. So, I mean, start talking to people with dignity and respect and listen to them. And one of the prison officers, she told me before I went to US now that she always used to try to look for something positive in that prisoners and really look for it and start there saying that, oh, you know a lot about music or whatever, So start the conversation with the positive and then maybe give open up a little bit, not private things, but be personal, be open-minded.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned those prejudices, which a lot of correctional officers have, for better or worse. But I think that's really the key, is to get out of that lens of how you view the populations you work with. I'm semi-ashamed to admit this, Nina, but years ago when I was a practicing probation officer carrying a caseload of high-risk individuals, just perhaps the way my brain organized things, trying to remember a caseload of close to 100 individuals. But I tended to define that individual based on looking in their file and reviewing their offense, the crime they committed. And that was sort of the initial lens, at least, through how I defined that entire individual. And I was speaking years later to a colleague of mine, and we were looking at this, I would argue, perhaps common practice over here. We thought, how bizarre that we would arguably take the worst thing someone did on the worst day of their life and define them with that lens moving forward. I know Shad Maroon and Fergus McNeil have talked about this so much as well, but that is sort of the modus operandi, again, with correctional individuals. They don't see that person as their future neighbor. They see that person for the crime they committed.
And nobody a born criminal,
Exactly. Nobody is a born criminal. I often say that, and I know I stole this from someone wiser than me, but that those individuals sitting in a prison cell are the same individuals that at one point were sitting in a school classroom next to you, but something altered their trajectory and put them on a different pathway. And I'm not excusing their behavior, but just trying to get a better understanding that we all started off in this sort of same population of well-intentioned, pro-social individuals. Many of us got into adolescent limited offenses, but we vectored out of that when we when we course corrected sort of on our own, but we have to realize that other folks are on a different trajectory, that so-called life course persistent trajectory. But we've just got to realize that their pathways were altered a little bit. What is, in your opinion, one thing we're doing here in Western prisons, or again, prisons which embrace that static security approach, somewhat related to the question I just asked about what an individual officer could do, but from a philosophical standpoint, what's one thing we should stop doing here in our Western prisons, our static anchored prisons?
Yeah, I think, we have talked about it before, be more open-minded and respectful. I mean, that's the starting point. But also, I'd love that prison officers here could study maybe more sociology, law, and even psychology. And they should be more interested in people and get rid of these prejudices that we talked about earlier, So start, greet people, say hello, how are you today? Talk to them, be kind, and treat people like it was your friends. So, I mean, we have said it many times in this podcast episode, but, things that are good, we can repeat.
And we're going to keep saying it, Nina, until the message gets out there. Thanks to people like you and me and Dr. Sarah Lewis and all the other great folks who are sort of part of our community here. I know you're currently in New York City. You'll be in Washington, D.C. later this week. And as you noted, in America until August 1st or so. What does the future hold for Nina Hanssen?
Well, I'm in New York. I'm so happy. It's my favorite city in the world. Meeting friends, family, singing, reconnecting. And I will, of course, continue this tour with the Norwegian Prison System book. And also in January, I will go to Brazil and visit some of the really exciting prisons there. And I'll be back in Denver in US next summer. So, I dream about maybe writing another book about this field because it's so interesting and there are so many great people and it opens door even to the prison for me. So, I'm living my dream now. So maybe I'll write about a new book about release to freedom, Mind the Gap. That is one of the chapters in the book that Red Cross, Sian Estenstad, is doing in Norway. I really, really want to help him or assist him to get his message out. Or maybe I do a book about new technology and how this changed our work and our lives. And as we talked about last time and also now, I mean, AI, yes, that's what it's called. It's the most transformative technology that we never seen and never will ever will experience. So I think, we have to use this technology to make life better for people. And I choose to be an optimist and also like to meet you in person, Joe, because this has been really great being a part of your program. And thank you so much for inviting me.
It is an honor whenever I get to speak with you. And speaking of our shared goal of meeting face to face one day in the flesh, I have family in Denver, so we may have to plan a visit next summer when you're back in the United States in Denver. I'd love to get out there to meet you, Nina.
Great.
Perfect.
It's a deal.
It's a deal. All right, Nina Hanssen.
Other people matters, and that's my thing, That's all that mattered, relations to others.
You're so right, Nina. When people who know me before I started my podcast and before I was blessed to be able to travel to all of these foreign lands to do what I do, ask me, how did this change come about, Joe? And to your point, I tell them, I really practice what we preach here. It's about, we know the value of social support and correctional reintegration. I augmented my social capital by meeting people like you, meeting people like Sarah, and I realized all these doors started opening and opportunities. So it actually works, folks. You expand your social capital, and then guess what? Your identity begins to change. The things you tell yourself about your abilities begin to change, and you begin opening all these doors for yourself. So again, it's a parallel process. The same themes that we're trying to impart into the populations we serve, that same medicine or that same serum that works on us as well. And I'm living proof of it. And I would contend you are too, Nina. Nina Hanssen, author of the book, Norwegian Prison System, Halden Prison and Beyond. Thank you for returning to the Criminologist podcast. And I look forward to either our next interview or, as I said, meeting face to face. It's been a real honor, Nina.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
So fun to reconnect with my friend, Nina Hanssen from Oslo, Norway, currently in the United States promoting her book, The Norwegian Prison System, Halden Prison and Beyond, which I should point out is co-authored by her friend R. Hodal, who we, of course, hope to have on the podcast someday. I also have been in contact with Glenn Martin, who Nina referenced in the interview, and he too has agreed to be on the program at some future point. Listen for that. Friends, there's still time to register for this fall's APPA Annual Training Institute in New York City. I have left links for that event in the episode description as well. I'm also including links to Nina's book, as also a very cool website that her publishers at Routledge have put together of Nina's accomplishments. Check that out. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Nina Hanssen on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
They have a library, they have a gym, they have a kitchen, and they have a lot of places for people to work and study. And what is unique is that the prison officer actually do that together with them. They eat together. They make food together. They play football or soccer, as we call it in Norway. They exercise. They take a walk in the wood, because usually in the Norwegian big prisons, we also have small woods you can play or you can go walk in. And they really interact and motivate the prisoners.
This has been a special APPA edition of the Criminologist Podcast. Their international relations team looks forward to sharing the insights of other subject matter experts from around the world in future episodes. The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.